Wilson, a 35-year-old experienced pilot, had spent his life soaring through skies and spanning continents. On the surface, his life seemed perfect. A flourishing career, admiration from colleagues, and the kind of composure that made him a natural leader in the cockpit. Yet, beneath his composed exterior, Wilson harbored a clandestine secret, an affair that could shatter everything he had built. The affair was with Aliana, a strikingly enigmatic 28-year-old flight attendant whose charm was as undeniable as her air of mystery. Their story began on a red-eye flight to Paris, just months after Aliana had joined the airline. Her effortless grace and warm personality instantly drew attention, captivating everyone she encountered. But it was the way her gaze lingered on Wilson that unsettled his predictable existence. Aliana was magnetic, beautiful, self-assured, and undeniably dangerous. She awakened emotions Wilson hadn't felt in years, breaking the monotony of his structured life. What started as fleeting glances in the crew lounge evolved into whispered conversations after flights and secret messages exchanged on burner phones. For Wilson, their connection was a forbidden escape, a thrilling deviation from the weight of responsibility he carried daily. Aliana's adventurous spirit was intoxicating, and before long, their stolen moments extended into nights hidden away in hotel rooms during layovers. Together they existed in a world that felt completely their own, away from the prying eyes of reality. What began as a thrilling secret soon transformed into something far more profound. Aliana started opening up to Wilson, sharing pieces of her troubled past and her ongoing search for meaning in life. She confided in him with an honesty that made him feel like her anchor, her safe haven. Wilson, captivated by her vulnerability and charm, found himself falling deeper. He started to believe their connection could be more than just fleeting passion. But Wilson was oblivious to the shadows Aliana kept hidden. Behind her radiant smile and magnetic personality lay darker, more perilous secrets. She wasn't merely a flight attendant seeking adventure. Her life was tangled in something far more dangerous. Without realizing it, Wilson was being drawn into a world he couldn't begin to fathom. To Wilson, their affair was thrilling but harmless. He didn't see how Aliana subtly steered their relationship, carefully masking her intentions. She crafted the illusion of a love story, never revealing the full scope of her plans. Every glance, every touch, every whispered word kept Wilson in the dark, believing their affair was nothing more than an irresistible connection between two people. Then, the turning point came. Aliana was about to ask Wilson for a favor. It seemed insignificant at first, a simple request that didn't raise suspicion. Yet, it was the beginning of something that would entangle him in a web of danger. He was in authority now. For now, Wilson was blinded by his feelings, unable to see the storm brewing just beneath the surface. He couldn't imagine that the woman who had captivated him was capable of pulling him into a far darker reality. As their bond deepened, Wilson unknowingly edged closer to the point of no return. The moment came a few months into their relationship. He had fallen hard for Aliana, and her presence turned his ordinary flights into something he eagerly anticipated. He believed their affair was an exhilarating escape, a secret that added a spark to his life. But Aliana had been orchestrating something far greater. It became clear one night after a long-haul flight to Singapore. Hidden away in their usual hotel room, Wilson lay beside her, exhausted but content. Aliana, however, seemed distant, her thoughts elsewhere. Her uncharacteristic quietness was the prelude to a request that would change everything. After a few moments of silence, Aliana finally spoke, her voice soft but carrying a note of unease. "Wilson, I need your help with something," she said, her tone hesitant, almost cautious. Wilson, caught up in the warmth of the moment, smiled without much thought. "Of course, Aliana. What do you need?" he replied, his voice steady. She hesitated, carefully choosing her next words. "It's about a friend of mine," she began, her gaze locking onto his. "He's in a little trouble and needs help moving some personal belongings on one of your flights. It's nothing dangerous, just sensitive items he'd prefer not to go through customs. Can you help?" The request made Wilson pause, his brow furrowed as a wave of doubt washed over him. "Cargo? What kind of cargo are we talking about?" he asked, his instincts alert. A seasoned professional, Wilson had built his career on following the rules, and this request felt like stepping onto unstable ground. So why did he strike a deal? As far as dealing with things in real life got for him, Wilson suggested that he resume training for a distance runner. Aliana leaned closer, her voice gentle yet persuasive. "I promise, it's nothing illegal," she reassured him. "Just a couple of boxes, sensitive items that my friend doesn't want flagged. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important, Wilson. You know I trust you." Wilson's mind raced. He understood the risk. This was a line he knew he shouldn't cross. Yet, the vulnerability in Aliana's eyes gave him pause. She had never asked him for anything before, and her plea carried a weight he struggled to ignore. "It didn't sound like much, just a couple of boxes," she said. "I don't know, Aliana," Wilson replied hesitantly, his voice edged with concern. This could get me in serious trouble if anyone finds out. I've never done anything like this before." Aliana reached out, placing her hand firmly over his, her touch both comforting and insistent. "Wilson, I'd never ask you to do something dangerous," she said, her voice steady yet imploring. "It's just a small favor. Please, for me." Her words lingered in the air, pulling at Wilson's resolve. The way she looked at him, like he was the only person who could help, made him feel significant, valued in a way he hadn't felt in years. Against his better judgment, he hesitated, his emotions beginning to cloud his reasoning. The thought of disappointing Aliana gnawed at Wilson, pushing him to ignore his better judgment. Reluctantly, he nodded. "All right," he said softly, his voice tinged with hesitation. "Just this once." Aliana's face lit up with gratitude. "Thank you, Wilson. I knew I could rely on you," she said warmly. But behind her radiant smile, there was a fleeting chill in her eyes, an edge Wilson failed to notice. The following morning, Aliana casually handed him the details about the cargo. Her demeanor was so nonchalant that it almost eased Wilson's unease. He reminded himself, it was a one-time favor, nothing more. Yet, as they prepared to board their next flight, a quiet sense of dread began to take root in his mind. During the flight, Wilson found himself distracted. His thoughts circled back to the decision he'd made, nagging at the edges of his consciousness. Little did he know, this seemingly minor favor was the beginning of a treacherous spiral, one that would pull him into a deadly web of deceit and consequences far beyond his control. Carrying out Aliana's request went smoothly. The cargo, a couple of unremarkable boxes, passed unnoticed. The flight unfolded like any other, just as Aliana had assured him it would. Yet, the uneasy feeling persisted, shadowing Wilson long after the plane touched down. Days turned into weeks, and Wilson tried to bury the incident in the back of his mind. He convinced himself it was harmless, a simple, isolated favor. But Aliana's behavior began to shift. She grew more secretive, frequently whispering into her phone and casting wary glances when she thought Wilson wasn't looking. Wilson began noticing things he hadn't before. How Aliana seemed unusually connected to certain passengers, her sudden disappearances between flights, and her unexplained meetings with people outside of work. It was as if she was orchestrating something much larger, something he couldn't quite piece together. Then, one evening after a flight, Aliana approached him again. Her expression was earnest, her tone calculated. "Wilson," she began, her voice soft but insistent. "My friend, he needs help with another matter." Wilson's heart sank as Aliana made her request. He knew exactly what she was about to ask, and every fiber of his being screamed at him to refuse. "Aliana," he began, his voice tense. "We've talked about this. I helped you once, but I can't keep doing this. It's too dangerous." Her smile faded, replaced by an earnest look of concern. "Wilson, please," she said softly. "You have to trust me. This'll be the last time, I swear. My friend is in a desperate situation, and we're the only ones who can help. It's just one more shipment." Wilson stood abruptly, pacing the room as frustration and fear swirled inside him. "I can't, Aliana," he said firmly. "You don't understand the kind of position this puts me in. If anything goes wrong—" His voice trailed off, unable to articulate the full weight of the risk. But Aliana wasn't giving up. She stepped closer, her voice gentle yet persuasive. She reminded him of how much she cared for him, how grateful she was for his help, and how important he was to her. Her words, laced with emotion, began to chip away at his resolve. Wilson felt cornered, torn between his deep feelings for Aliana and the nagging sense of foreboding he couldn't shake. "Please, Wilson," she pleaded, her voice soft and imploring. "After this, it's over. I promise." Against his better judgment, Wilson caved. The thought of letting her down was unbearable, and despite the unease clawing at him, he nodded reluctantly. "All right," he murmured, his voice heavy with hesitation. "But this is the last time." However, this time felt different. The cargo wasn't small or discreet like before. It was larger, heavier, and shrouded in mystery. Wilson didn't ask questions, but the weight of uncertainty bore down on him. His mind buzzed with unanswered questions as he tried to ignore the warning bells ringing louder than ever. During the flight, Wilson found it impossible to focus. Every sound in the cockpit, every glance exchanged among the crew, felt charged with unspoken suspicion. The atmosphere was heavy, and Wilson couldn't shake the feeling that he was teetering on the edge of a precipice, one wrong move away from disaster. Was he being watched? Did someone already know about his involvement? These thoughts plagued Wilson as the plane touched down and the mysterious cargo was discreetly offloaded. Though the operation went smoothly, the knot of anxiety in his chest refused to loosen. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and Wilson was deep in a world he didn't understand. He couldn't shake the feeling that Aliana was keeping secrets darker than he'd ever suspected. The following morning, a chilling surprise awaited him. Tucked inside his locker at work was an unsigned letter. The message was terse but clear. "Stay quiet, or else." Wilson's heart raced as he read the ominous words. He glanced around the room, searching for anything, or anyone, out of the ordinary, but everything seemed normal. Or was it? Panic crept into his chest as the realization dawned. He had always played by the rules, meticulously avoiding risks. Yet now, he was entangled in something far beyond his control. And for the first time, he began to grasp the gravity of Aliana's shadowy world. It wasn't just dangerous, it was deadly. The woman he thought he loved was no longer someone he could fully trust. The anonymous threat marked a dangerous turning point in Wilson's life. Each step he took felt fraught with peril, like walking on thin ice that could crack at any moment. He tried confronting Aliana, desperate for answers. "What's going on, Aliana? Someone left me a threat," he said, his voice trembling with both fear and frustration. But Aliana dismissed his concerns with unnerving nonchalance. "Don't worry, Wilson," she said lightly. "It's just a precaution to make sure everything stays under the radar. There's nothing to fear." Her casual tone unsettled him even more. How could she treat this as though it were normal? Wilson knew better. This was anything but normal. The growing sense of foreboding became impossible to ignore, and he began observing Aliana with a new, wary perspective. He noticed things he'd overlooked before. Her hushed conversations with certain passengers, her cryptic phone calls, and the mysterious way she would slip away between flights. It became clear that Aliana was living a life far beyond their relationship, a life Wilson had unknowingly stumbled into. And with every revelation, the walls of his seemingly secure world closed in further, leaving him unsure of what lay ahead, or if he'd survived to see it. The more Wilson observed, the more he realized how little he truly knew about Aliana. Her charm and warmth had once blinded him, but now, every action she took seemed shrouded in mystery. One evening, after a particularly tense flight, Wilson decided to follow her. She had casually mentioned meeting friends for dinner, but his instincts whispered otherwise. Trailing her from the airport, Wilson kept a safe distance as she weaved through the city streets. His heart pounded with each step, uncertain of what he might uncover. Eventually, Aliana arrived at a small, dimly lit cafe on the city's outskirts. Wilson parked across the street, his eyes fixed on her as she entered. A few minutes later, a man joined her at the table. Wilson didn't recognize him, but something about the stranger sent a chill down his spine. He exuded danger. Sharp features, an air of authority, and a controlled demeanor that made him seem untouchable. From the shadows of his car, Wilson watched their interaction intently. Aliana looked uneasy, her hands gesturing nervously as she spoke. The man, on the other hand, remained composed, his movements deliberate and minimal. This wasn't a casual dinner with friends. Wilson's stomach knotted as he watched the exchange unfold. When their conversation ended, the man slid a small package across the table. Aliana hesitated only briefly before slipping it into her bag. She stood up, glancing around the cafe cautiously, before stepping outside. Wilson ducked low in his seat as she walked past, his mind racing. What was in the package? And who was this man? One thing was clear. Aliana was entangled in something dangerous, and by extension, so was he. He followed her back to her apartment, parking a few blocks away to collect his thoughts. Questions swirled relentlessly in his mind. Who was the man? What was Aliana hiding? And how deep had she dragged him into this murky world of secrets? The following day, unable to suppress his fear any longer, Wilson confronted her. "Aliana," he began, his voice trembling. "I know something's going on. I saw you last night, with that man. Who is he? And what was in the package?" Aliana's eyes widened in surprise, but she quickly composed herself. Her usual warmth was replaced by an icy tone. "You shouldn't have followed me, Wilson," she said flatly. "I told you not to worry about these things. You promised to trust me." "Trust you?" Wilson shot back, his frustration boiling over. "I'm getting anonymous threats, smuggling who knows what, and now you're meeting dangerous people in secret, How am I supposed to trust you when you won't tell me the truth? Trapped in this web of deceit, Wilson felt the danger tightening its grip. Every effort to pull away from Aliana's shadowy world only seemed to drag him further in. Her words echoed relentlessly in his mind. You can't walk away. They're getting suspicious, Wilson, Aliana warned during one of their brief, intense phone calls. They think you're planning to turn on them. The tension between them was suffocating. Aliana looked exhausted, her face etched with the weight of a burden she could no longer hide, but Wilson had no sympathy left. His patience was gone. The room fell silent as the gravity of her words sank in. Wilson's mind raced, trying to process the betrayal and the danger he now faced. His feelings for Aliana were real, but so was the risk. He couldn't believe how far she had gone and how deeply she had hidden the truth from him. The next few days passed in a blur of anxiety. Wilson wrestled with an impossible choice: comply with the syndicate's demands or refuse and face the inevitable consequences. Smuggling the shipment meant crossing a line he could never uncross, but rejecting the job meant sealing his fate. The man's lips curled into a dark, humorless smile. Out, he sneered. There is no out, Wilson. You're part of this now, whether you like it or not, and if you try to run or turn on us. He let the threat hang in the air, unfinished but crystal clear. The man's gaze locked onto him, sharp and unforgiving. You've been acting strange, pulling away. We don't like that. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a sinister whisper. People who think they can run from us never get very far. The man stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. His cold eyes scanned the room and his face betrayed no emotion. We need to talk, Wilson, he said, his voice steady and chilling. The life he once knew, a steady, peaceful existence as a pilot, was now a ticking time bomb. Aliana's behavior only fueled his unease. She became increasingly distant, her involvement in her mysterious dealings deepening. Her promises of safety rang hollow, and Wilson began to see through the cracks in her reassurances. One sleepless night, after hours of wrestling with his thoughts, Wilson decided he couldn't live like this any longer. He couldn't spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, waiting for the shadows to catch up with him. He needed a way out, any way out. Determined, he resolved to confront Aliana one final time. This time, he would demand the truth. They met at her apartment, the air between them heavy with tension. Wilson's mind was made up. Whatever it took, he would no longer be a pawn in her dangerous game. The tension between them was suffocating. Aliana looked exhausted, her face etched with the weight of a burden she could no longer hide, but Wilson had no sympathy left. His patience was gone. I need the truth, Aliana, he said, his voice steady but firm. No more excuses, no more lies. Tell me everything. She stared at him, her eyes clouded with emotions he couldn't fully decipher. Fear, guilt, perhaps even regret. Finally, she spoke, her voice heavy. You're right, Wilson. You deserve to know. She stared at him, her eyes clouded with emotions he couldn't fully decipher. Fear, guilt, perhaps even regret. Finally, she spoke, her voice heavy. You're right, Wilson. You deserve to know. Wilson's heart raced as she began to confess, each word tightening the knot in his chest. The truth was worse than he had imagined. Aliana wasn't just a bystander caught in a dangerous web. She was deeply embedded in it. The man he had seen her with, the mysterious package she had transported, and the secretive meetings were all part of a larger operation. Aliana had been using her role as a flight attendant to smuggle illegal goods across borders. And the people she worked for? An international crime syndicate. "I didn't want you involved, Wilson," she said, her voice breaking as tears welled in her eyes. "But they were watching me. They knew about us. If I hadn't gotten you to help, they would have come after both of us." Her words struck like a blow. "You're telling me you dragged me into this to save yourself?" he asked, his voice cold. Aliana nodded, guilt written all over her face. "I thought I could protect you," she whispered. "But everything spiraled out of control. They don't let people walk away, Wilson. Not me, not you, no one." The room fell silent as the gravity of her words sank in. Wilson's mind raced, trying to process the betrayal and the danger he now faced. His feelings for Aliana were real, but so was the risk. He couldn't believe how far she had gone and how deeply she had hidden the truth from him. "I can't do this anymore," Wilson finally said, his voice trembling with both anger and fear. "I don't care what they do. I'm done." Aliana's eyes filled with desperation. "Wilson, if you leave, they'll come after you. They'll come after both of us." "I'm already in danger," he shot back, his tone icy. "And it's because of you." Aliana's face crumpled as Wilson turned and walked out of her apartment. He left her standing there, engulfed in a world he wanted no part of. But as he drove away, a sinking feeling settled in his chest. He knew it wasn't over. People like those Aliana worked for didn't let anyone walk away. Not her, and certainly not him. The days that followed offered no solace. Anonymous calls and cryptic threats haunted him, each one darker than the last. Aliana reached out less frequently, and when she did, her voice was filled with panic. She was spiraling, and so was Wilson, caught in a nightmare he couldn't escape. The shadow of the syndicate loomed over him, a constant reminder that the consequences of Aliana's betrayal were far from over. "Aliana." Wilson's voice cracked with both anger and fear as he shouted into the phone. "What have you dragged me into? They're demanding I do another job. I can't keep playing this game. I'm not you. I'm not made for this." Aliana's tone shifted, calm yet resigned. "There is no way out, Wilson, not unless we give them what they want." It didn't need a signature. Wilson knew exactly who it was from. The ultimatum left no room for negotiation. He was cornered, his options dwindling to one: comply or face the unimaginable. "Loyalty," the man said coldly. "From you, from Aliana. Betray us, and you'll both regret it." On the other end, Aliana's voice trembled, a mixture of guilt and desperation. "Wilson, I never meant for it to go this far," she said, her words laced with regret. "I thought I could protect you, but now they're watching both of us. We don't have much time." One evening, a sharp knock on his apartment door jolted Wilson from his thoughts. His heart leapt into his throat. No one ever visited him without calling first. Approaching the door cautiously, he peered through the peephole. Standing on the other side was a man he recognized instantly. One of the syndicate's enforcers. Wilson's hands trembled as he reluctantly opened the door. One evening, after another grueling day at work, Wilson returned home to find a letter slipped under his door. His hands shook as he unfolded it. The message was brief and bone-chilling. "One last job, or else." One night, just as he was preparing for what felt like his final flight, Wilson's phone rang. Aliana's voice was frantic on the other end. "Meet me," she whispered. "I have found a way out, but you have to trust me." Desperation gripped him. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone. He dialed a number, his mind spinning with what might come next. That night, Wilson sat alone in the suffocating darkness of his apartment. His mind raced, searching for answers that didn't exist. He couldn't stay silent forever, but defying the syndicate would mean gambling not just his life, but Aliana's too. Every passing moment felt like the walls were closing in. The days dragged on, each one darker than the last. Threats no longer felt like distant warnings. They were seeping into his daily life. Routine flights became heavy with paranoia, every passenger a potential spy, every takeoff a potential last. Cutting ties with Aliana hadn't made him any safer. The syndicate was always watching. The man stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. His cold eyes scanned the room and his face betrayed no emotion. "We need to talk, Wilson," he said, his voice steady and chilling. The man's gaze locked onto him, sharp and unforgiving. "You've been acting strange, pulling away. We don't like that." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a sinister whisper. "People who think they can run from us never get very far." The man's lips curled into a dark, humorless smile. "Out," he sneered. "There is no out, Wilson. You're part of this now, whether you like it or not. And if you try to run or turn on us..." He let the threat hang in the air, unfinished but crystal clear. The next few days passed in a blur of anxiety. Wilson wrestled with an impossible choice: comply with the syndicate's demands or refuse and face the inevitable consequences. Smuggling the shipment meant crossing a line he could never uncross, but rejecting the job meant sealing his fate. "They're getting suspicious, Wilson," Aliana warned during one of their brief, intense phone calls. "They think you're planning to turn on them." "We have to find a way out," Wilson said, his voice rising with panic. "I can't keep doing this, Aliana. I just can't." "What do you want from me?" Wilson asked, his voice taut with fear and anger. Wilson's heart pounded like a drum. He understood what this was: a final warning, his last chance to fall back in line, or he'd face the full wrath of the syndicate. Summoning what little composure he had, he managed to stammer, "I don't want any trouble. I just want out." Wilson's heart sank. In that moment, he realized that Aliana had made her choice. She was too entangled in the syndicate's web to break free. Their love, once a source of hope, now felt distant, overshadowed by the danger looming over them. Wilson's mind spun as Aliana explained the dire situation. The syndicate had labeled him a liability, too close to their operations to simply walk away. They were pressuring him to smuggle another shipment on his next international flight. Though Aliana had bought them a little time, it was clear that the clock was ticking. Wilson's mouth went dry. "About what?" he asked, barely able to keep his voice from shaking. Wilson's stomach churned at her words. What was he supposed to do? He wasn't built for this world of shadows and crime. All he had ever wanted was a simple, peaceful life, a steady career, and maybe even a future with Aliana. But that dream had crumbled under the weight of her lies and the criminal web that had ensnared them both. With that, the enforcer turned and left, leaving Wilson frozen in place, paralyzed by the gravity of his predicament. The door clicked shut, but the weight of the encounter lingered. Wilson knew his worst fears had come true. He was trapped in their grasp, with no way out that wouldn't come with devastating consequences.
One evening, after another grueling day at work, Wilson returned home to find a letter slipped under his door. His hands shook as he unfolded it. The message was brief and bone-chilling. One last job or else. It didn't need a signature. Wilson knew exactly who it was from. The ultimatum left no room for negotiation. He was cornered, his options dwindling to one: comply or face the unimaginable. Desperation gripped him. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone. He dialed a number, his mind spinning with what might come next. Aliana, Wilson's voice cracked with both anger and fear as he shouted into the phone, "What have you dragged me into? They're demanding I do another job. I can't keep playing this game. I'm not you. I'm not made for this." On the other end, Aliana's voice trembled, a mixture of guilt and desperation. "Wilson, I never meant for it to go this far," she said, her words laced with regret. "I thought I could protect you, but now they're watching both of us. We don't have much time." Wilson's mind spun as Aliana explained the dire situation. The syndicate had labeled him a liability, too close to their operations to simply walk away. They were pressuring him to smuggle another shipment on his next international flight. Though Aliana had bought them a little time, it was clear that the clock was ticking. "We have to find a way out," Wilson said, his voice rising with panic. "I can't keep doing this, Aliana. I just can't." Aliana's tone shifted, calm yet resigned. "There is no way out, Wilson. Not unless we give them what they want." Wilson's heart sank. In that moment, he realized that Aliana had made her choice. She was too entangled in the syndicate's web to break free. Their love, once a source of hope, now felt distant, overshadowed by the danger looming over them. The next few days passed in a blur of anxiety. Wilson wrestled with an impossible choice: comply with the syndicate's demands or refuse and face the inevitable consequences. Smuggling the shipment meant crossing a line he could never uncross, but rejecting the job meant sealing his fate. One night, just as he was preparing for what felt like his final flight, Wilson's phone rang. Aliana's voice was frantic on the other end. "Meet me," she whispered. "I've found a way out, but you have to trust me." Wilson hesitated, torn between a flicker of hope and the crushing fear that it was already too late. A deadly betrayal. Wilson met Aliana in a secluded spot near the airport. The streets were quiet, the air thick with unease. Aliana looked as fraught as Wilson felt, her eyes darting nervously as she approached him. "What's the plan?" Wilson asked, his voice strained with desperation. Aliana swallowed hard, her hands trembling. "I've made a deal," she admitted. "We deliver the shipment, and they'll let us go. It's our only chance." Wilson's stomach twisted with doubt. "How can you trust them? How do you know they'll keep their word?" Her eyes filled with sorrow. "I don't know," she said softly, her voice barely audible. "But we don't have another option. If we don't go through with this, they'll kill us both." Wilson stared at her, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He didn't trust her plan, or her. But he had no alternatives. The syndicate had cornered him, and Aliana was the only one who seemed to understand how to navigate their dangerous world. Together, they prepared for the flight, each move shadowed by tension and fear. Aliana seemed distant, her mind elsewhere, and Wilson's unease grew with every passing moment. He noticed the furtive glances, the way she checked her phone obsessively. Doubts gnawed at him. Was she hiding something? Was this another betrayal? As they arrived at the airport, Wilson's instincts screamed at him that something was wrong. He stopped her, his voice low and sharp. "Are you sure we can trust this?" Aliana's face faltered, a mix of guilt and fear flashing across her features. "You just have to trust me, Wilson, please." But in that instant, Wilson saw the awful truth in her eyes. Aliana had betrayed him. The deal she struck wasn't to save them both, it was to save herself. She had offered him as a scapegoat in exchange for her freedom. Before he could react, the trap was sprung. Armed men emerged from the shadows, surrounding them in a flash. Wilson's heart raced as he saw the cold realization in Aliana's eyes. One of the enforcers stepped forward, a gun in his hand, his smile cruel. "We don't take kindly to those who think they can leave the business," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "Thanks for making this easy, Aliana." Wilson turned to her, his voice a broken whisper. "You sold me out." Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't deny it. "I didn't have a choice," she murmured. "I'm sorry."